Hello and welcome to Hope Church's series looking at the book of the prophet Isaiah. We've been going for some time now, and we're nearing the end, but we've still got a little way to go. And we're in chapter 52 today. We saw earlier that Isaiah looks up at God and he looks down at the human condition. And this is our stock photo of Isaiah. Not sure what he actually looked like, but anyway, he looks up at down at the human condition, and in particular at the condition of the nation of Israel, which is where he lived. This shows you where we're up to in Isaiah. We saw that part one. There's lots of sort of warnings and threats about the upcoming exile to Babylon, when all the people or most of the people in the land of Judah were taken away from their home and marched across the desert, or around the desert, to the land of Babylon, where they were slaves. But part two, which is where we are now, is chapters 40 to 66 of Isaiah, and that is a sort of a prophetic warning or message ahead to the people who are now in Babylon. So it's written to people who are already in Babylon at that point. There's this interesting part of part two called the servant songs. They're sort of these mysterious poems, of which we've looked at three, but we're just about to get to the fourth. We actually looked at the fourth already as well, because we did it at Easter. But where we are in this chapter is right before that. So actually the end of chapter 52 is the beginning of this fourth servant song, but we're not going to look at that. We're just looking at, but it's important when we analyze this chapter to see where we are, that the servant song 4 is just around the corner, and it's very much in view in what we're going to be looking at. So here's the passage on one page. I'm not going to actually read it. If you're joining us on Sunday morning, hopefully you've read it by this point. But if you're watching this on YouTube, you might want to pause the video and take time to read what this passage actually is saying. And as I've said, this isn't actually the whole of chapter 52. It's just most of it, not including the bit that includes the servant songs. So I've coloured this passage. I like to colour things. And this shows you that there's two sort of interleaved things going on in this chapter of Isaiah. The red writing is two declarations of God's saving power, speaking in general terms about the rescue of Jerusalem and the rescue of Zion, which is another term for Jerusalem. And then the blue ones are more specifically addressing the actual situation of the exiles in Babylon. We'll treat them all in turn. So first of all, you have this: wake up, Zion, wake up, dress yourself with strength as if it were your clothes. So it's saying, wake up. We saw that in a previous chapter, in chapter 51, it also had this similar wake up. It said, wake up, arm of the Lord, wake up. So they were actually, the Israelites were speaking to God and saying, we want you to act on our behalf. Dress yourself with strength with your clothes is exactly the same wording. Then also in chapter 51, it says, wake up, Jerusalem. That's now God speaking to them. Wake up, get up. The Lord has handed you the cup of his great anger, and you have drunk from it. But now we saw in chapter 51 on Tuesday that the Lord's anger that was given to Jerusalem has been taken away from them and given to their enemies. And how that happens, well, again, that's sort of not quite clear, but it's dependent on the servant songs. It's a change of status from being under God's anger and being slaves to the king of Babylon to, well, a place of honor and respect. It's shaking off your dust, and he's even taking your place on your throne and dressing yourself with strength and glory. So God has changed the status of these exiles through, we will see, his servant. And they've gone from the situation where their enemies are walking all over them to what we see to this place of honor. And the servant song told the key. It says the servant will see, he suffered the things we should have suffered. He took on himself the pain that should have been ours. It's a change of status. And this is a total and final cleansing for all time. That's what this servant is going to accomplish. In the next section, we see God's anger at the situation of his people. He's saying he's discontented. He's saying basically, I don't owe Babylon anything. He says, when you were sold as slaves, no one paid anything for you. Now no one will pay any money to set you free. And says, and then makes a comparison to the exile in Egypt, where they lived in Egypt for a while, and now Assyria has captured them. So it's a comparison between, not for the first time in Isaiah, the exile in Babylon to the captivity in Egypt, which was much earlier in Israel's history. But the problem is that God's name and God's honor is being insulted. It says, look what's happened to them. And answers the Lord, once again, my people have been taken away, and no one paid anything for them. Those who rule over them brag about it, announces the Lord. All day long without stopping, people speak evil things against my name. So it's by God's name, it means God's own character. It's who he is. It represents him. And then it says in verse 6, but the time will come when people will really know the meaning of my name. They will know what kind of God I am. They will know that I told them ahead of time they would return to their land. Think of the first half of Isaiah. They will know that it was I. And that last verse can actually be translated, I am the speaker. In other words, God told them about the captivity in advance. And actually God enabled it to happen. And he's going to bring them back from captivity just by speaking the word. And so he's saying once this day comes, when people will know the meaning of my name, they will know that it was I who was in control the whole time. That's what the Lord is saying. So there's a couple of questions to discuss on these two sections. First of all, how do we bridge the gap between what God has declared to be true of us through the gospel and the situation that we're currently living in? So just as the exiles in Babylon, God is saying, sit on your throne, put on your garments of splendor. And yet they were still in exile. They were still in a very difficult situation. Yet that was what Isaiah was speaking to them. So how do we go from God says, this is who you are, versus this is what my situation actually looks like? And the second question is, well, what kind of God is the Lord? So we saw on the previous slide, they will know what kind of God I am. Well, what kind of God is the Lord? So let's discuss those questions. So there's a few minutes. We'll pause the video at that point, and you can discuss that. We'll discuss those questions in groups. Okay, so then we see the second half of the chapter, and again we're back in red. So it's kind of a wonderful declaration of God's power. It's kind of a crescendo, or perhaps an avalanche of praise. It starts off very small, with some messengers coming to Jerusalem. And it says, how beautiful to see them coming down from the mountains with a message about peace. How wonderful it is when they bring the good news that we are saved. How wonderful when they say to Zion, your God rules. And then it grows and grows and grows, and says those on guard duty, they next are seeing they're shouting out the message, and then finally burst into songs. They see the Lord returning to Zion, burst into songs of joy together, you broken down buildings in Jerusalem. Now, again, it's kind of an end to exile. What could that be? Actually, the exile, in some sense, truly ends. We've got the message on the hills, the watchmen. Then you've got the ruins of Jerusalem, bursting out into songs of joy. So I think there's something to this in the story of Palm Sunday, which you can read about in the New Testament, where Jesus, he's gone around proclaiming good news in Israel, and then then he finally returns to Jerusalem. He rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. And people are rebuking his disciples and saying, don't say Hosanna to the Son of David. Don't say blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And Jesus responds by saying, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. And I wonder if he may have had this in mind, these broken down buildings in Jerusalem bursting into songs of joy together. But then you have Isaiah's sort of trailer voice, verse 9, this theme of comfort. First, the Lord has comforted his people, he's set Jerusalem free. And actually, the second half of Isaiah begins with comfort my people. That's how it started. This theme of comfort comes up quite a lot. But then verse 10 is again a trailer for the next chapter. Isaiah, in a sort of a film trailer, you have, the voice of prophecy. It's a big booming male voice says, once upon a time there was a tale of wonder and of glory and of heroes and villains and a chosen one, whatever it is. You can think of the big booming film trailer voice, and that's similar to a lot of Isaiah's prophetic words. He's speaking about something that hasn't yet happened, but it's very important and very meaningful. And similarly, this speech of the Lord will use the power of his holy arm to save his people. All the nations will see him do it. Everyone from one end of the earth to the other will see it. I think there's a similar thing going on. It's a trailer for the next chapter when we'll see the servant who rescues God's people. So finally then, this section, you who carry the objects that belong to the Lord's temple, leave Babylon, leave it, get out of there. This is obviously back talking specific to the exiles in Babylon again. This is specific instructions to leave Babylon, but it also talks about those who carry the objects that belong to the Lord's temple. Leave it, get out of there. So I think the idea is that it's the work of the priests and the Levites. So here's a picture of the high priest with his clothes, who would serve in the temple. And this term for pure actually isn't just about sort of cleanness. It's also about preparedness for a purpose. So Isaiah earlier uses this of the polished arrow in God's quiver, which is again a reference to the servant. But it's the same term for pure and clean that we have here. For pure. And Paul quotes this chapter about this, don't touch anything that isn't pure and clean, in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. And we'll look at that in the questions in a few minutes. But there's again an Exodus comparison. So it's a comparison both to the Exodus and to the exile, where in the Exodus, if you remember, they have to run out of Egypt in great hurry because there's this sort of great threat of Pharaoh has let them go, but he might change his mind any minute. So they had to sort of hurry away. Or when the exile happened, they were sort of marched out of Jerusalem off to a foreign land they didn't want to go to, and they were sort of forced to leave. But Isaiah is saying when they return from Babylon, they won't be in a great hurry. They'll have plenty of time. It's urgent. It's important that they should leave, but it's not. They're not being sort of hurried away in a great rush. And you can read about that in the book of Ezra, where they finally do return with the stuff from the Lord's temple back to Jerusalem. And finally, again, it compares to the Exodus. It's saying, the Lord will go ahead of you and lead you. The God of Israel will follow behind you and guard you. And it reminds you of the pillar of fire and the pillar of smoke, which protected God's people in the story of the Exodus. So it speaks of God's people, and actually the very beginning of the chapter, the strength as if it were clothes, and the clothes of glory reflects sort of priestly clothes. It's saying that God's people, when they are God's priests, and Israel was a nation of priests, God is with them. He's going before them and behind them to protect them. So finally, let's discuss these questions. How can we, or why should we be pure in the way that Isaiah suggests here? And remember, compared to 2 Corinthians 6. And the second question is, what does God's going ahead and following behind look like for us? So let's discuss those questions together in groups.